All right, good morning, everyone. Good morning.
Good morning.
Hello.
Hello.
Welcome, welcome. And on behalf of the Stockholm Environment Institute and also our partner organizations, we would like to welcome you. It's our pleasure to welcome you here for the second International Conference on Fossil Fuel Supply and Climate Policy. Some of you here have been here before, some of you here are new. We're happy to see those of you who have been here 2 years ago, but we're likewise very, very happy to see all of you with the new faces. And we're looking forward to 2 very exciting days with a full program, with lots of exciting speakers and lots of exciting discussions. Maybe as a practical remark, can I ask you to turn off your mobile phones just for a second? Thank you. So we have a packed room here in Oxford, but as you can see from the equipment here, we also have people who will be joining us online today and tomorrow. So this is going to be live streamed in this room. In the other room it will be recorded, so you know that as well. But there will be online participation as well, at least that's what we're hoping.
No, you're already online.
Exactly, we're online right now. So, as I said, this is the second international conference, so I think we have moved on a lot of the discussions that we've had 2 years ago, focusing on fossil fuel supply and its implications for international and national climate policy. And we really, really think that it's important to keep this discussion going, and we're really grateful to have you here to have that discussion with us. But before we go on, and Michael will introduce the discussion, the topic in much more detail. Also, I should say, Michael Lazarus, everyone. Hardo van Asselt, everyone. Good morning. But before Michael introduces the topic in more detail, and also, of course, introduces the opening panel in more detail, a few logistical remarks that I will have, but also a few acknowledgements, which are, of course, very important. So we first of all would like to thank the organizations and the funders, without whom I think none of us would be here right now. So first of all, thanks to KR Foundation and Alex we have here in the room for making this possible. But also we have financial support from the Swedish Research Council, Formas, and the Swedish Development Agency, SIDA. So thank you. Also thanks to the steering committee, who have been instrumental in making this happen by providing us feedback, also on the last conference, but also providing us suggestions, helping us to review the abstract that all of you have submitted. So there's a number of the steering committee here in the audience. Maybe you can just raise your hand so people will know who you are. Right, indeed. Thanks to all of them sitting nicely in the first 2 rows. So practical remarks, important to pay attention here. First, very importantly, we have a very tight schedule with a lot of speakers in different rooms. So please try to be on time. And this, of course, primarily holds for the speakers and the moderators, but also as participants, try to be on time, try to be there when the session starts. Also, if you haven't done so, make sure that your presentations are uploaded on the laptop well before your session starts. And if you haven't done so yet for this room, talk to Emily, right here. And if you haven't done so for the other room, talk to Jess, who's sitting right there, and they will help you get your PowerPoints on the laptops. Then other logistical points. So some of you may be gluten-free or have other dietary requirements, so not vegetarian, but let's say the more special dietary requirements. Naomi, who is sitting right there, so wave to everyone. So if you're gluten-free or have a special dietary requirements, come and talk to Naomi in the break, and she'll have a card for you for the lunch breaks. Then there's a few program changes at the last minute. Always happens with conferences like these. Check the conference program online. Obviously, we could not update the last minute changes in the printed program, but if you look on the online program, you'll find the latest updates, some of the changes, but we'll also instruct the moderators so that they know which program changes have happened. Then some practical and maybe some of the more boring remarks, but they have to be made. This is Oxford, one of Oxford's oldest colleges. So please take care where you walk. Some of the surfaces, especially around the other room, the memorial room, are somewhat uneven. So just don't be stupid, is this the basic message? And then finally, should passions in the discussion flare up so high that you trigger the fire alarm, there will be 2 fire marshals, friendly fire marshals, Michael and Emily, who will guide you to the doors right there, outside, and you'll meet in the garden afterwards. But follow them and try it in an orderly fashion. Right, I think that is the main practical remarks. Then before we actually go to some of the discussions, we also wanted to start with a little bit of audience participation. And this is a bit of an experiment for the 2 of us, so hopefully it will all work out well. But we actually are going to make the biggest faux pas or the biggest no-no that any conference organizer can do at the beginning. I was asking you to turn off your mobile phones just now, but actually get them out now. So please get them out now. And to the extent that you can, oh, and maybe this is also important, Wi-Fi passwords are actually on your badges. So look at the back of your badges and you'll find your Wi-Fi passwords.
Should we give everybody a second?
Yeah, I think you'll need that. But in any case, to the extent that you can, go to www.menti.com, use this code, insert this code. That's all you need to do for now. And then we get to a number of questions, which we'll run through in a second. So I'll give you a second to get that, and also the people online can participate in this. So menti.com, enter 769745. Right.
Who's there? Who's on their way?
Getting there, getting there.
Okay.
Right. I'll give you a few more seconds. You can also do this on your browsers, but in any case, once you're there, you'll get to see the following. The first question. An image question. We have 5 images here, and we would like to know from you, which of these is, in your view, the biggest challenge for climate policy? So we have flying. We have a meat eater, so meat consumption. We have a very nice picture of this conference, fossil fuel supply. We have income inequality, and we have the presidents of the United States.
I have a different.
Yeah, it's loaded up with a different question.
Different
for some
question.
reason.
I like yours.
Okay. Which question are you
I was
seeing?
hoping that was just me.
Which fossil fuel does your work address?
Right, then we'll move on to that. Let's see if it works nonetheless.
Thanks for being the guinea pigs.
Right. They're already
look at
answering.
that.
Very good, very
Wow.
good. Thank you, thank you. 48, 49. And it's actually very good division as well. Coal, oil, gas. Right? A few of them got lost at this conference, it seems. Or they might actually be interested. Who knows? Who knows? Or, but it's a pretty even division. Pretty even division. Also, good response. Thank you all. Right, like pretty even, and that's a good question. So basically, I need you to tell me what the next question is going to be. So, sorry.
Because you're going to tell us.
Let's
Going
let's
back.
see.
Going back.
I will go back.
Addressing fossil fuel supply is essential for meeting climate goals.
Who gives you the most hope for tackling
Okay.
Okay, we're at the right question. Okay, which?
This total audience participation.
Yep. So we have a number of organizations here which should be listed. So we have grassroots activists, social movements, national governments, subnational governments, financiers and investors, businesses, social movements doing very strong here,
Wow.
dispelling all kinds of theories in social sciences.
There we go.
United Nations we also still have on board.
Does the OECD come under United Nations or what?
It's not on there.
Are you going to give us hope, Ron?
Right? So it's either that there's a lot of hope in social movements or there's a lot of people working on social movements. We'll leave that in the middle. Subnational governments, cities, states, very, very timely with the Global Climate Action Summit just a few weeks ago.
Investors are getting a fair shake here too. Investors are getting a fair
Yep,
shake
yep.
here too.
All right, it is interesting. I think we'll at least have one panel dedicated to social movements during this conference. So in a way, it confirms some of the interest and some of the excitement around that. We're going to test where we're going to go with the next question. So let me just go to the next one and see if it works. Addressing fossil fuel supply is essential for meeting climate goals. Is this the question that you're seeing as well?
Yes.
Good, good.
They're one step ahead of us. Very
Wow.
impressive.
Very good.
Right.
It is a very, very selective
Do we
crowd.
want to ask this question?
The next conference we'll be asking this question will be the OPEC annual meeting.
And also, we're planning to ask this question at the end of the conference, so don't go too far to the right yet.
We'll still have some room to shift. Right, 84 responses, strongly agree. All right. Then let's see if this one now works. Is this the question you're seeing now as well? Yeah. Good, good. Which of these you would say is the biggest climate policy challenge? Right, again, a little bit of a biased crowd here, but income inequality.
What is an unbiased crowd?
Maybe pleasing to see for the Americans among us that it's not the President of the United States, which seems to be the biggest obstacle. So again, a lot of you focusing on fossil fuel supply, also income inequality, and maybe the two are actually completely interconnected. That's again something we'll be discussing here at the conference, looking at issues of equity. All right, and then we'll go to the final question, and hopefully that'll work as well. I have to run through the other ones again. Right, this is an open question, and if all goes well, if you see this question, you'll have the space to give 3 answers, 3 keyword answers, in which you can indicate what you hope to get out of this conference. And let's see if that is working. Can you see the question and the space for answers? Hope, good. The first insight, yes, we provide lots of insight at conferences. More hope, more ideas, inspiration. No one is expecting good food, or? You'd be correct, by the way, but. Knowledge, ideas, inspiration. New colleagues, coffee, yes, very important. There will be coffee later on. Right, I'm going to stop it here. We'll get back to Menti at the end of the conference, and we'll also try to ask some of the questions and also reflect on whether some of these expectations we were actually able to live up to them. But I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Michael, who will run you through a bit of the thinking that we've had at SCI on supply-side climate policy, and basically try to give you a very brief introduction of the topic and our thinking, and before introducing the opening panel. So Michael, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Harald. All right, so I'm supposed to dish up some hope and inspiration? I'll give it a go. Fossil fuel supply and climate policy. That's why we're all here. So you would think, based on that answer, it's pretty obvious. Connecting the dots between the two is fairly straightforward. But for many of us, like me, for the first 25 years of my career working on energy and climate policy, I didn't make that connection. I recognize that, of course, as I worked on issues like developing climate action plans with various jurisdictions, working with policymakers and stakeholders on designing emissions trading systems, this is what I did for many years and continue to do as well. But in that context, there was always the expectation that if we took care of the demand for fossil fuels with renewable energy, energy efficiency, smart market signals, then the supply side would take care of itself. And then, of course, you had this important vested interest, and the political economy of the issue was extremely important to address when legislating and other issues. But the idea was always that climate policy was the domain of demand. And so we talk about demand-side climate policy. So in a sense, it was like a bit of a race. And though no thoroughbred, I did feel like I had blinders on. And for me, in a sense, it was running down a racetrack and never quite getting to the finish line in this game. And then there was my sort of, I don't know, to use the misused Matrix analogy, red pill, blue pill moment. My red pill moment was a few years back. Across the street, a journalist was coming to town to give math lessons. And that's what I do for work. A lot of times in these stakeholder processes, I'm the guy they turn to do the math. But this guy was named Bill McKibben, as many of you know, and he was on his do the math tour. So I'd go across the street, check it out, find out what's going on here. And it really was, for me, something of a remedial math class. And I was opened up to this concept that is sort of at the foundation for a lot of the discussions, and thanks to Carbon Tracker and the room today for really being the foundation for this idea, or bringing it back. It wasn't a new concept. It had been in the literature, but it really hadn't quite achieved prominence. I won't go into the details of, many of you are familiar, but the basic notion is this tension between the fact that the amount of fossil fuels in reserves in the books of companies and the expectations of countries to develop far exceeds the remaining carbon budget. By how much, we can all debate. How the reserves are defined, we can quibble. But the basic tension exists that if we were to achieve our climate goals, we can't have all of this, and there's a bubble of sorts. There's going to be losers trying to fit everything in that large bubble into the small one, the remaining carbon budget. So losers mean stranded assets. But the opposite tension also exists of whoever's invested in this, the institutions, the individuals, the communities, are going to fight like heck to continue to develop what they have, and so you have these problems as well of entanglement and lock-in. Also, for me, the revelation in the room is I looked around, and it was the Symphony Hall, and it was packed with civil society out in large numbers the way I hadn't seen it when we were presenting with the Western Climate Initiative the plan for a new cap-and-trade system for the West. So something else was going on here that many of you are tapped into and working on. So then, in addition to coming into view, it came into the mainstream around 2013. And I keep coming back to these two individuals at OECD and IEA who kind of set the tone and were a sign that all of a sudden this wasn't just something in the literature, a side conversation, but when you have the chief economist of the International Energy Agency reaffirming this unburnable carbon concept, that 2/3 of proven oil reserves of oil, gas, and coal have to be left undeveloped for a 2-degree pathway. And in fact, more interesting, Angel Gurria's great speech that he gave on towards a zero carbon pathway, where he said governments everywhere on behalf of their citizens have major stakes in bringing fossil fuel to market. Carbon entanglement, a beautiful phrase, will not easily be undone. Indeed, that sparked lots of the research and debate that many bring us to the room today. Many of you helped create this literature, even before what we were talking about here, have been in this area for some time. We had McGlade and Eakins, which got a lot of attention. We have Sky's Limit and folks there whose work has raised this issue quite broadly. We've had critics out there like Nick Butler, who in this same conference room 3 years ago, basically himself tried to burst what he thought was the bubble of thinking around stranded assets, because not everybody buys into these ideas. So there's a healthy debate out there right now, and hopefully we can deepen that here today. And then there was something that was quite a remarkable moment, and I know it may make some of us feel a little bit wistful to see this face up here, but when President Obama announced his rejection of the Keystone XL pipeline, he did it with language like this: to prevent large parts of this earth from becoming not only inhospitable but uninhabitable in our lifetimes, we're going to have to keep some fossil fuels in the ground. And to have the leader of the #1 fossil fuel producer, #1 today in oil, #2 today in natural gas, #3 in coal, to say words like that was quite an accomplishment in a sense. It opened up this space in a new way. And so you saw in the Obama administration not only decisions taking into account the effects of fossil fuel supply, really for the first time in a major economy, on climate grounds. And that perhaps was unique in that context. So we'll hear more about that in a session tomorrow. In fact, I think we have folks who were in the Obama administration at the time. Atlantic and Arctic drilling off limits after a certain point in time, as well as suspending new coal leases in order to review the whole leasing process on climate grounds. Quite a substantial development in thinking about addressing fossil fuel supply from a climate policy perspective. Of course, you can see the ominous ticker on the bottom. Donald Trump sits down with Jake Tapper on State of the Union. This is 2015, mind you. So ominous indeed. And we can talk a little bit about what that means and how reversible everything is, in a sense, or not. And it has continued. And here we have Jacinda Ardern from New Zealand announcing their decision to ban offshore oil drilling, exploration, and so forth. The continuing leases continue to produce. And this is another theme that sometimes the reaction is you can't stop today. A lot of this is about sending the signals of a transition that is coming years down the road and starting with the exploration phase. So we'll talk more about that in the first session that follows the opening session, as well as other sessions today, about what's going on around the world in France, in Ireland, in Latin America, oftentimes not for climate reasons. And non-state actors as well have begun to act in this space. So here we see former Mayor Bloomberg and Bank of England President Mark Carney sitting down and announcing the release of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures report that was quite had a profound effect in mainstreaming the idea that companies need to think about how their investment portfolios fare in a 2-degree world. And from that helped to bring on a number of the reports that oil majors have produced. And we're going to hear about, again, later today and discuss, are they sincerely aiming to meet that 2-degree goal in their planning? What's going on with these reports and how can it be done well? The other thing to note is the World Bank, major institutions, financing institutions, deciding to get out of upstream oil and gas as well as coal investment. These are quite significant advances in policy. But not so fast, says Governor Brown of California. Here he is actually reflecting, I believe at this point in his press conference, on the report that Pete will talk about that SEI released that said, look at some options for considering phasing down oil production because that may make sense on oil grounds. And for some climate leaders, this is not an easy concept. And we know that, and for many reasons. Many good reasons, as well as not, and perhaps debatable reasons. He likened what we were suggesting in the report, or the idea of restricting production anyway, to acting like OPEC and restricting oil to increase prices. In fact, perhaps that is the effect that we're talking about. But it carries a certain baggage. At the same time, we'll hear a little bit in the opening panel about some advances. Despite those statements, California is considering these options quite seriously right now. So we'll talk across this conference about this idea of supply-side climate policy, climate action, climate efforts, and what do we mean when we talk about that. And just to be clear, because it is a potentially confusing concept, because supply-side also means producing renewable energy, arguably. We're talking about fossil fuels here. So ideas that we've seen out there and policies we've seen implemented include extraction and exploration limits. We'll talk a bit about producer subsidy removal tomorrow afternoon. There's ideas that many of you in this room have been exploring and investigating. This gives you a sense of the palette and why. And so a pair of scissors here. So thanks to Richard Dennis here and Fergus Green as well for their paper that appeared in the last conference's special issue, and we'll have another one after this issue that was cutting with both arms of the scissors. And there and in other places, the ideas have been laid out about why you might want to consider this. Others in this room have written about this as well. Supply-side policy, by bringing more ideas and more actions into the palette of what you can do on climate, can widen essentially the mitigation cost curve, to speak in economic terms, can help you reach your goals potentially at lower cost, more efficiently, if done well. It can, if you reduce demand without reducing supply, or reduce supply without reducing demand, you get rebound and leakage. But if you do both together, you counteract each other and have counteracting effects. There are also the advantages you see on the supply side of mobilization, as many in the audience have talked about here, is there is the added moral pressure. It's more transparent, easier to mobilize civil society around this, which can help in raising support for public policy. At the same time, the incumbents are very strong. So the opposition, as we all know, is very strong as well. So there are many reasons why, and there are many concerns, including potentially backlash. Let's talk about that over the next couple of days. Then, if you look in the international space, the international negotiations, which evidently folks have relatively little hope in, I think that was 4 votes for the United Nations, but let's not forget that perhaps the United Nations itself is not the vehicle, but convening nations together is absolutely essential to solving this problem, I would submit, and continues to be. And in that regard, the Paris Agreement was and remains something of a milestone that has gotten countries to commit to their nationally determined contributions, while a reduction in emissions from their current policy trajectory not sufficient to get to the 2 degree or 1.5 degree pathway. So we've talked a lot and explored a lot in the COP and UN conversations about this emissions gap and how to close it. But we also have to close a production gap, and that's the gap between what countries are expecting to produce and what they can produce in a 2 and 1.5 degree pathway. And we're beginning to see glimmers of countries beginning to reckon with that in the international stage, because it's important for countries to set norms with each other on moving in this space as well. So finally, let me just leave you with what is perhaps the most vexing and difficult questions around addressing fossil fuel supply and climate policy. And those have to do with the fact that fossil fuels are a powerful, and energy in general, a powerful tool of state interests across the world to achieve their own policy objectives. So geopolitics is extraordinarily important. At the same time, obviously income inequality and fossil fuel and any other kind of basic development are very interconnected. So who produces the remaining fossil fuel under a 2 degree or a 1.5 degree world? And how do we ensure a just transition? And this is a topic that we'll be discussing in several panels over the next few days. Extremely important one. So let me just leave you with that. And I think that, in a sense, there's no better way to start off but by bringing up 4 colleagues who have been working on related issues in various venues across the world. So with that, I'm ending this presentation. I'm inviting our opening panelists up to the stage. Richard Dennis from the Australia Institute, chief economist, my colleague Pete Erickson, senior scientist at Stockholm Environment Institute, Tim Gray, executive director of environmental defense in Canada, and Glada Lahn, research fellow at Chatham House. And together they've been working in a number of interesting venues in Australia, in Canada, California, Norway, in Africa, in the Middle East. And so we'll go one by one, hear from each about what they're working on right now and what's going on in these contexts. And then we'll open it up to a little panel discussion and then open it up to the full audience. So we have until 10:30 for this. And so let me turn to Richard. Now, Richard, let me just see where my notes are here on Richard. Everybody knows who you are, Richard. But in case you don't know Richard, prominent Australian economist, troublemaker, I think. I think you said you're just getting into a little trouble over the port of Newcastle recently, public policy commentator. You often see his columns in Australian newspapers. He's also an author. And I just have to say the titles of your books because it's so much fun. Econobabble, How to Decide Political Spin and Economic Nonsense, and Curing Affluenza, How to Buy Less Stuff and Save the World. So Richard, you've been at the heart of the debate in Australia around what would be the world's largest new coal mine, right?
Yep.
Carmichael Adani. So what's going on there, and maybe connect that a little bit to what you've been thinking about in terms of supply-side policy.
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me at the back all right? Yeah, so look, Australia, it's a long way away. It's easy to forget about. But we own a continent down there. It's 4,000 kilometres across. There's a lot of fossil fuels on a continent that big. So the decisions that we make about the supply of fossil fuels in Australia are far more important than anything we've ever signed up to do for our consumption. And I think that's a real problem that we need to grapple with, because so many of the forums that have been invented around the world, to tackle climate change are all about how much fossil fuels a country uses. Well, a little country like Australia exports enormous amounts of fossil fuel, coal, oil, gas. Australia has a larger share of the traded coal market than Saudi Arabia has of the oil market. Well, everyone knows that Saudi Arabian oil production decisions affect price. Well, the Australian Resources Minister, the Australian Prime Minister, the Premier of our largest coal states hope and are currently planning to double Australia's coal production. Well, if Saudi Arabia doubled oil production, you all know what that would do to price. Well, if Australian investment decisions are borne out, we will have a significant downward pressure on global coal prices. So if you think that carbon pricing has a role to play, and I do, I'm an economist, I think price matters. Well, if price matters on the demand side, price matters on the supply side. My country's supply decisions can ruin your country's taxing decisions, or more likely, the investment decisions in Southeast Asia and other developing countries. So, yeah, look, Australia's a strange little country, but we're determined to cause climate change. No, please understand, this is my nation's foreign policy. There are a couple of other Australians in the room. I can see Georgia. This is what we do down there. All right, and we always have, and we'll show up at your international forums. And at Paris, we were determined to be in the coalition of ambition. We took umbrage that we were left out of the coalition of ambition while proposing to subsidise the world's largest coal mine. And that disconnect between demand-side promises and supply-side subsidies is something that I think conferences like this are really important to unpack. So, yeah, look, in Australia at the moment, the Adani coal mine is still chugging ahead. Political pressure stopped the biggest subsidies that were proposed, but the proponents of Adani have come out with a lower cost version recently. The Queensland government's offering them free coal. They have unlimited access to free amounts of water. There's all sorts of infrastructure and other environmental subsidies that are still being offered to encourage development. And it's interesting, in recent years the Australian debate has changed in the way that Keystone XL's changed debate elsewhere, but it took the environment movement a long time in Australia to care about supply side, but now it's very much at the centre of politics and policy. And yeah, it's fun to be surrounded by people that think supply side matters.
So you just had a change of government?
No. No, we had our fifth Prime Minister.
Okay, true. Change of Prime Minister.
In 5 years, but the government is stable. We've chucked out a Prime Minister. The current Prime Minister, he's only been in the job a couple of weeks, literally waved a lump of coal around in Parliament House only 2 years ago. Waved a lump of coal around to demonstrate his enthusiasm for this great resource that he's determined for my country to sell more of to you. Interestingly, that lump of coal had been lacquered so that his hands didn't get dirty. True story, don't want dirty hands. But this is what you're up against, and we will show up. My country will show up at international forums and tell you that we're keen to tackle climate change. We're very keen. We'll sign up to anything on the demand side. No, because it doesn't matter. Our foreign policy, our trade policy is to sell enormous amounts of coal and oil and gas. What we promise to do within our borders, we should do more, but that's not where we cause climate change.
Now, haven't you seen some interesting dynamics within the country? Some of your states are not too keen
Absolutely. And look, the politics are changing, like fracking, hydraulic fracturing of gas has really changed policy and politics. So a lot of states have announced moratoria on extraction of oil in that form. That's kind of emboldened people to go, oh yeah, you can just ban stuff you don't like. Who knew? Like we banned whaling, no, because in the policy language, banning stuff, it's so old-fashioned. But the public love banning things they don't like. And policymakers have told them they're wrong. No, let's do it with an elaborate trading mechanism instead. Just give me 4 years and I'll come back to you with something you don't understand. And again, I'm not opposed to emissions trading. I'm not. But the public are happy to coalesce around simple policy instruments that meet their preferred outcomes. So in Australia, moratoria on fracking of oil has been really important. The kind folk from Norway want to extract oil from the Great Australian Bight. That's nice of them, because we all know Norway wants to tackle climate change. But that's helped to mobilise people in South Australia who really don't want new oil extraction in such an iconic place. The Queensland government came under enormous pressure over subsidies to the Adani coal mine, so much so that it changed its position in the middle of a state election campaign and probably won the state election because they were forced to ditch support for the mine. And I mean forced, like the Premier could barely utter the words, but the public liked what she said, even if she didn't like saying it. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of, and New Zealand, the little country off to our right, it's really leading Australia in lots of ways at the moment, including the oil exploration moratorium that you mentioned. So look, I guess the thing I'd emphasise is that the public like it, the media understand it, and you can actually have a good old-fashioned political fight about it. And I mean that in a good democratic sense. Whereas no one understands the design details of elaborate demand-side programs. So what happens in Australia is everyone agrees in principle and almost nothing happens in practice. But when you frame up the debate as, do you want this mine to go ahead or don't you, pick a side, you shouldn't underestimate the policy impact of that kind of political clarity.
Thanks, Richard. So let's move from down under to up above the United States in Canada, where Tim Gray is Director of Environmental Defence Canada, who's been working with lots of organizations on supply-side issues there, been engaged in the Alberta Climate Leadership Plan and the Clean Economy Alliance and creating Ontario's Climate Action Plan. So you've experience across the great country of Canada. And so recently, some interesting news out of Canada around the Trans Mountain Pipeline and the court decision to put it on hold, but the deals that went on with the Prime Minister Trudeau making an unexpected initiative to purchase the pipeline for the state of, for the country, and then all sorts of back and forth with Alberta, and is the Prime Minister's carbon plan dead because of not getting the pipeline? Because what's going on there? There's a lot of... unravel that for us a little bit.
Sure.
After I just mixed everything up.
Well, yeah, in a lot of ways, I think Canada's like the frozen version of Australia. We're obviously, in terms of the demand side, a relatively small producer of emissions relative to other global scale economies, but very large producer of fossil fuels, especially oil and gas. And I think our political leaders are trapped between those two realities, trapped between the incumbents who want to attract investment and get approvals for projects that include ones like Trans Mountain, which have been focused on by civil society as an example of exactly what we don't need. And you're seeing massive resistance from First Nation communities, environmental organizations, and it's moved into the political mainstream. So now you have provincial government on one side of the Rockies where the oil is going to go that very much does not want it, and the other side of the Rockies where it's produced that does, and it's turned into a major conflict that the federal government has now been dragged into, I think perhaps a little too willingly and ultimately quite foolishly. But that desire to do something about climate, and when our Justin Trudeau was elected, he ran off to Paris and very much wanted to be part of efforts to show leadership in that sector, to bring in all kinds of demand-side initiatives, a new federal climate plan that has both supply components and demand components, and a lot of that is proceeding apace. And I think that desire to do something on that front was sincere and to change trajectory from the previous Canadian government, which had been wholly offside on doing anything around climate at all. But then the whole incumbency factor of the fossil fuel industry in Canada, especially in the West, has just made it very, very difficult to change the channel. And it's in Alberta, the public there so strongly aligns with the interests of the fossil fuel industry that it makes it politically almost impossible for the provincial government there, or at least they perceive it that way, to articulate any other kind of future other than one of ongoing fossil fuel growth. And that's dragged the federal government into it. And now we find ourselves in a position where you have them forking over $4.5 billion to buy out an old pipeline, and with the promise of spending $7 to $9 billion to build a new one if they can ever get it through legal system and opposition from First Nations and governments, etc. So a real quagmire for them. Ultimately, though, I think that the debate is very good for Canada, and I think ultimately good for the world, in that having such a focus on a supply side issue, whether or not the oil sands should expand, whether or not we should be building more capacity and locking in massive investments to allow the expansion of that industry. By having that debate on the front pages of the paper every day, I think it's creating a huge space for a conversation about climate that often gets lost in when we're talking about cap and trade. And our organization spent several years working on the design of the cap and trade system for Ontario as part of joining Western Climate Initiative of California and Quebec. And it all turned out really well. We were selling, had great auction results, and we had several $1 billion in the bank, and we were starting to run all kinds of demand side programs. And this guy wanders out of the wilderness and says, "Don't worry, I'm going to get rid of that awful carbon tax that you're paying on your gasoline," wins the election, cancels the program, and most people didn't even know it was happening because they had never understood it in the first place. So I think, unfortunately, to win some of these battles in the long term, I really do think we need to focus on simple issues, like we need to ban the pipeline, we need to keep it in the ground, because all of these sophisticated economic instruments that would make this transition easier seem to be lost on the public and very, very vulnerable to overturn by regressive politicians.
Okay, so there may be some folks in the room, and part of me as well, that says, hey, but wait a second, are we throwing all of that under the bus on the demand side in this process? The Trudeau administration has a plan for carbon pricing across Canada that you could say, and so Rachel Notley, the premier of Alberta, said, I don't get my pipeline, you don't get your carbon pricing plan, or something along those lines. I probably messed that up again too. But point being is that, is there some Faustian bargain, or some bargain that something being lost when we move to the focus on the supply side? A risk that we will lose important mechanisms or support for them.
Yeah, that's been talked about a lot in the media. The idea that by fighting fossil fuel supply expansion, especially the Kinder Morgan pipeline, that the environmental community is making the oil industry and government so mad that they're just going to take away all of those nice demand side tools that have been developed. But I think what has actually happened in Canada is the moment that Trump was elected in the US, and it became clear that the trajectory around demand side restrictions and policies and any kind of supply side constraint was going to go away, given the control of the Senate and the House and the executive branch by particularly regressive government on climate, the oil industry in Canada did an immediate reversal of their soft support of even demand side activities, and very quickly we're helping to busily dismantle all of that effort, both at a federal level and provincial. So you would have seen that tackling of all that in the absence of any kind of public opposition to supply side expansion. But it wouldn't have been in the front pages of the newspaper, because it would have been left to people like me and others who work in the sector to try and to explain to them, why dismantling really complicated climate policy was something they should care about. But they find it much easier to understand the implications of massive expansion of the oil sands and a pipeline.
Right. I guess one lingering question for us to consider, maybe a later question, is how can all of this public interest in these simpler approaches be harnessed not just for the supply side, but for other policies as well? So before I turn to Glada, I just want to say, those of you who opened your program will say, wait a second, this is not Zipporah Berman up here. So, and Zipporah is very, very sorry to not be able to join you. She was originally on the panel, and Tim very kindly agreed late yesterday to join this panel as a colleague of Zipporah's who works on Canadian issues. Those of you know Zipporah know how passionate and how engaged she has been on supply side issues in Canada and elsewhere. She had a family emergency that came up. She very much regrets not being able to join us here today and join you all. So that's from Zipporah, and that's why you're seeing the mismatch with your program. So again, thank you again, Tim, for sitting in on this panel. So, Lana, we've been talking a lot here about Australia, Canada, we'll talk about California, but let's face it, much of the world doesn't live in all of these high-income countries, and nor is that where all these fossil fuel resources are. It's very entwined with development in a number of other parts of the world. And you've been, as senior research fellow at the Energy, Environment, and Resources Department at Chatham House, been working on petroleum sector governance and sustainable transitions in oil and gas exporting countries who have a lot at stake in what's going on here for climate reasons or other reasons, as countries potentially turn away from these resources towards electric vehicles for other reasons. So you've been working, and you've done a couple of great reports. One most recently, Carbon Risk and Resilience, how energy transition is changing the prospects for countries with fossil fuels. I highly recommend it to everybody. So tell us a little bit about your work with oil and gas producers in the Middle East and Africa. Have you noticed any changes in attitudes towards climate action as a result of the markets moving and changing and the things we've been talking about here?
Yeah, maybe I'll start with Saudi Arabia, because it's the largest oil exporter now. I think it just hit the #1 spot. Saudi Arabia exports about 10% of what we consume globally in oil and oil products. And it's kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. There's a very complex, has had a very complex relationship with the climate change agenda. And as many of you know, I think Saudi Arabia was involved in the climate negotiations in Kyoto right from the beginning, seen by most people as a blocker, because it saw any global agreement to constrain carbon as directly in conflict with its interests as a major exporter. And if your government revenue is 80-90% dependent on your oil export revenue, then you are going to work very hard not to see a constraint on growth in that market. However, there's been certain factors that have changed Saudi Arabia's position to what it is today. And I think it's interesting to think perhaps around 3 factors that are leading that change, or have driven that change. One is the need to conserve fuel domestically and the consumption, the battle that Saudi Arabia is having with consumption. And I'm talking about also that, you know, this is faced in the other countries in the Gulf Cooperation Council countries. Given that the countries have developed very much along an oil and gas fueled pathway and subsidized or, you know, priced those fuels very, very low domestically, they now suffer a huge problem with inefficiency and growth going way beyond what was expected and actually eating into the potential for exports. So that presented a very acute challenge for Saudi Arabia, which gains a lot of its international status and power from its spare capacity, its capacity to sway the market, to change the prices. So gas in particular became an issue because it didn't have enough gas for its growing power demand, so it had to push crude oil into the power system, more and more crude oil. So it burns over 500,000 barrels a day of crude oil, which could be going into the international market. So that was one challenge that drove thinking about new methods of efficiency. So of course there was pricing, which is a major issue, and they have made some development in that area, but also thinking about renewable energy, thinking about efficiency mechanisms. That growth in that thinking is, you know, kind of aligned with what people are talking about in terms of you know, the energy transition more globally. So that's come together with, I think, you know, holding the COP, holding the climate negotiations in Qatar was a big deal for the Gulf countries. I think there was a lot of criticism of how it was done and some of the approaches, but it has, you know, as far as I can see, it did make an impact on the mindset. People started to ask questions about climate change, ask questions about what their own countries were doing, particularly from the younger generation. And that's my third point, is young people. You know, in a country where 60% of your population is under 30, many of them much younger than that, you're thinking, you know, 20, 30 years ahead. And it's also a country that is it's an allocative state model. So the government has to provide for the people in many, many ways. There's, 13% unemployment amongst nationals, and people are asking questions about whether that economic model can sustain. And hence you see the various reform attempts by Mohammed bin Salman when the price of oil dipped in 2014. So I think that, you know, and that would be the fourth one is the actual impact of the oil price crash. It's really accelerated the thinking about diversification, economic diversification. That doesn't mean that everything, you know, is looking to switch towards non-oil green growth and so on. Of course, Saudi Aramco, like any other oil company, is looking to maximize the value of its assets. So I would say in that sense, it's you know, as a company, they're really engaging with those issues of how to create the most efficient low carbon fuels and see their advantage in producing, you know, being one of the lowest carbon producers in the world, and maximizing those efficiencies. I mean, one interesting thing is that recently Saudi Aramco formed an MOU with Mazda in Japan, the car company, and we've been talking for a while about this competition for you know, not just from other oil companies, but from the car manufacturing industry in terms of future market for oil. And their MOU is about Mazda producing, you know, the most efficient vehicle and Saudi Aramco supplying the most efficient fuel. So they want to keep, you know, their skin in the game. They want to keep the automotive industry dependent on liquid fuel rather than switching to electricity. There's lots of other things I can mention, like diversification into chemicals and plastics. There's the Royal Court order for Saudi Aramco now to buy SABIC, the 70% of SABIC, the petrochemicals company, because chemicals and plastics are seen as a high growth area, whereas oil is probably growing at half that level at the moment and seen to slow down radically. So I would say there's a really complex web of competing interests in a country like Saudi. They're different across the Gulf. I won't talk about each one, but you know, you see some interesting things going on with carbon capture and usage in the UAE, and they have to do something about the amount of gas that they use domestically. That's, that's why you see Dubai bizarrely building a coal plant, but there are reasons behind that, even if you don't agree with them. Just a quick word maybe about other countries that are not in such a, shall we say, comfortable position as the Gulf countries. Sean Bradley and I, who wrote the Carbon Risk and Resilience report, we were really focusing on what energy transition means for lower income countries that have oil and gas resources, are thinking about developing them, or are already partially dependent on them. Some of those countries, they have, that they don't have the luxury of, maybe they don't see themselves as having the luxury to keep things in the ground. And if you were to say, keep it, talk about this, keep it in the ground, I think the response would be very much, that this is some sort of Western conspiracy, some sort of, neo-colonialist attempt to again sort of stymie their development and keep them dependent on aid. And I think this is a really important consideration. We hear again and again, why should they not be allowed to have a fair crack at the whip, and develop these resources? So it's a very loaded conversation. However, I think there is very strong interest in both established countries like Angola and Nigeria, who have suffered from over-dependence on oil and are looking for new ways to diversify. See Nigeria launching green bonds, for instance, and with huge agricultural potential. That's been damaged by oil development. And you also see new exporters like Ghana, who are genuinely interested in how to kind of future-proof their economy from the same kind of problems and from this potential slowdown and decline in the oil market that is likely to come about. Who knows exactly when, but there is interest in how you diversify in time for that. And I think diversification of the economy is absolutely key to those decisions. So just finally, I think I'll pick up on what Michael mentioned, the words carbon entanglement. I think it's a very apt phrase here, that some of the newer producers or prospective producers have the opportunity to make different choices so they don't entangle themselves quite as much as those countries we were talking about in the Gulf that now face acute problems. And I think that's the question for donors, financiers, all the international entities that help these countries with the development, is how do you put them on a pathway that both maximizes their resource potential, but in a way that doesn't entangle them for the future.
Great, thanks so much, Glada. Let's come back to some of that in just a second, because I think there's an interesting connection to what's going on in California with what you just talked about. So my colleague, Pete Erickson, he's a senior scientist, and he leads the climate policy program at SEI, based in SEI US, based in Seattle. And so he and I have worked together for many years now. And he's done a lot of great work on oil markets, carbon lock-in, all sorts of other issues, and most recently applied that lens to California. And you're just back from California a couple of times. Once, I believe, a workshop held by the California Air Resources Board to discuss this question of supply-side policy. And then most recently from GCAS, the Global Climate Action Summit, where you held a side event there, and you've been involved in discussions with people at the state. Where does this whole question stand? I mean, California oil, I mean, most people don't even make that connection.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I think there's anyone interested in trying to figure out how to do a wind down of oil production has a number of reasons to look at California. Not only are they thought of as a climate leader to such degree that they get to host the Global Climate Action Summit, but they, perhaps more importantly, they've been a major oil producer. California has, for decades, most of the 20th century, been the largest oil producer in the US. It was a California oil company, Standard Oil, that later became Chevron, that first found commercial oil in Saudi Arabia. So it was only, in the 1950s that Saudi Arabia overtook California in oil production, actually. And California is a very large oil, still producer, 170 million barrels a year. That's down from its peak at 300 or 400 million barrels a year, but still substantial. On the consumption side, California consumes 600 million barrels a year, as it has for decades now. That's 15 barrels a person, 6 tons of CO2 a person. So oil is central to California, both in production and in consumption. And so then there's been this new development in the last year where California's governor has said at the National Press Club there in that photograph, we have 2 parts of this oil challenge. We have consumption and we have production. And he went on to say something, and I'm paraphrasing here, but when you start reducing consumption, that opens the door to reducing production as well. Now, he may have likened that to joining OPEC, but he has kicked off a legitimate conversation. Some would argue he's been pushed to kick off a legitimate conversation by the more than 800 community and environmental groups in the state that have signed a letter this year asking him to begin a managed phase out of oil production in the state. So I think the debate in California this year has occurred along at least 4 dimensions, and let me just lay those out briefly. One is the technical, the intellectual, the emissions dimension, right? Where I think there's been actually pretty good agreement that reducing production does reduce global CO2 emissions. Of course, there's been some debate about to just how much degree, but I don't think there's been any serious disagreement on that front. The second dimension is the environmental justice dimensions. Most of California's oil is produced in areas of the state that the state government has identified as being highly pollution vulnerable, mostly in communities of color. And a state-sponsored commission actually studied pollution from oil wells, recommended a 2,500-foot buffer zone be established between oil wells and schools, communities, other homes, other places where people congregate. The third dimension is along cost lines. California oil is fairly expensive to produce, $50, $60 a barrel break-even costs for California oil, which suggests that it may be stranded in a low-carbon transition, or at the very least, that there'd be relatively few profits lost if California was to purposefully forego that oil. And then the last dimension ties to what you were saying, Glada. This is more of a geopolitical dimension. The biggest zinger, I think, that we've heard in California this year from the governor and from other critics of such a policy is that, hey, if we did this, it's going to increase the price of oil a little bit, and Saudi Arabia and other undemocratic regimes, sort of codes for bad people, are going to benefit from this this policy. But no discussion of the limited carbon space that exists. Why should California be the one that gets to produce that barrel and not either Saudi Arabia or some of the poorer countries that Glada mentioned? So I think so far I'm drawing 3 lessons from California, and I'm sure there are many others. Lots of people in the room have been following this and contributing to it. But one is that limiting oil production, people get that. People get the connection between oil and climate. There were 30,000 people marching in San Francisco before the summit a couple weeks ago, and I saw one journalist tweet that she thought, a third of the signs being held up were about keeping California's oil in the ground. People get this, it motivates them. The second is that the politics can still be very challenging, as you might imagine, not just from politicians, but also from other big NGOs, for environmental climate-focused NGOs, for whom this kind of thinking challenges their theory of change around how you make progress in climate policy. And the third is that the just transitions element, the aspect of what are those people in the oil patch going to do. I think you need articulate, credible, prominent voices in those areas. I think that's one place where California has maybe been that's been underutilized in the California debate. So Supply-side climate policy is having a moment in California. As Michael said, there's this state commission now starting off that the Air Resources Board is launching, and there's going to be a new governor in 2019. So it still is a great place to watch and to be involved.
So let's pick up on a couple things there. One, the social mobilization part, but also just this wealth transfer. When you were in that webinar, in that event at ARB in a debate with a number of other folks, this issue just kept coming up over and over again. The geopolitics, the wealth transfer. Why should we let others produce? Because we produce it cleaner. We have, if it's not the fact that, we've heard this in Norway as well and elsewhere, right? We produce the cleanest oil, or they don't actually produce the cleanest oil in California. It turns out it's some of the dirtiest oil with some of the most impacts and the highest greenhouse gases, but yet they do have some regulations, and it's a democratic society. That's ironic. And then in places that you've worked, in places like Ghana and Tanzania, who've yet to really develop their resources, they're hearing, oh, watch out, you shouldn't develop it because the demand for oil is going down for various reasons, including climate. How do you reconcile these views, and how do you make this conversation work in a reasonable way in both California and a lower income country and in Canada? I mean, how do you have a reasonable conversation about this issue? Any ideas? Yeah.
Look, I think of this argument, it's like wrestling an octopus. You've only got 2 hands and it's got 8. And whenever you pin them down, it just slaps you with another 6. So, do we want higher fossil fuel prices or lower fossil fuel prices? Right? How do you tackle climate change with lower fossil fuel prices? Right? Is it really a criticism of a climate policy that it makes fossil fuels more expensive? Right? And this is their trick. It doesn't matter what we say, they just make up some unrelated argument. So you just got to go back. You can deal with each of the criticisms they put up in turn. You don't have time to do that this morning. But the only way to navigate the argument is just to go up a level and say, sorry, from the governor of California's point of view, part of tackling climate change is expanding oil production. Make them explain that. No, this is important, because if you try and explain global inequality and how you're going to tackle global inequality through your moratorium on oil exploration, you have no chance. So you have to keep it simple, but I would suggest you actually have to put it back on them. It is bizarre and ridiculous to suggest that expanding oil production or coal production is the best way we can think up to help poor people. That expanding coal or oil production is the best way we can think up to reduce global inequality or cause a just transition. Like, their proposition is absurd, but you have to not fall into the intellectual trap of kind of the arrogance of trying to explain how the world works all the time. No, make them explain it.
Problem is they're already doing that, being quite good at it. I mean, they're just being untruthful and saying, oh, our oil is cleaner.
Well, we make clean coal in Australia, I assure you.
And they line up, economists to say, oh, not only is our oil cleaner, but we need to produce it because it's going to help poor people.
It's quite interesting because I think SoCal, when they were producing in Saudi back in the day, the methane emissions were massive. They're through the roof. So actually, Saudi has reduced those a lot because it stopped flaring and used the gas in the master plan. But it was interesting. I saw a chart, and so historically they're responsible for a huge amount of emissions.
Yeah, our oil is not just clean; it's ethical. That's their there's transition, of course, in other places outside of richer countries. Countries that probably have a better argument for hanging on to the last bits of production as we wind it down on the planetary scale. But there's also having arguments around the just transition for the people that are actually employed in the industries that are going to be affected within the country. And there's a pretty good example of what's going on with coal in Alberta, because across Canada, coal is being phased out as an energy source. and government's putting some real money and real thought into transitioning the coal workers involved in that. And that has brought along the unions that represent the coal industry there. And so that does have to be tackled. But that can occur only when governments get to the point where they are actually saying, yes, we're going to do this. And we haven't got anywhere near that on the oil side, but we have on coal.
So just quickly on that, I think the just transition stuff is so important, but it can be so confusing. And in Australia, we've shown quite persuasively that the new coal mines around the Adani mine in North Queensland will unambiguously harm coal regions in other parts of Australia. And that's an entirely new political dynamic in Australia. So you now have members of parliament who would wave a lump around, who are opposed to new coal mines in Queensland because they want to protect jobs for coal workers in the Hunter Valley in New South Wales. And I think these kinds of divisions have not been factored into the political or the policy calculus in the past. But frankly, in Australia, new coal mines in a new region will just suppress production from existing coal mines. So how do you have a just transition when you're bringing new people into the coal industry? Why would you bring new people into the coal industry to displace existing people in the coal industry? The politics are as bad as the economics.
All right, so let's go back to this question of social mobilization. And Pete, you were mentioning 30,000 people in the streets of San Francisco, many of them holding up signs around oil. At the same time, you got a lot of pushback of folks who said, why are we attacking Governor Brown? He's a real climate hero. Look at what he committed to with carbon neutrality by 2045 and so forth. And so this is a tricky issue. How do you harness the social mobilization effort in a way that keeps everybody moving forward, or maybe disrupts? Maybe disruption is part of the calculus and necessary to make change happen. What do you see as the promise of social mobilization and the risks in these contexts?
Well, I see it mostly as a promise, I think, in the sense that, the climate crisis is so dire, we need to get off fossil fuels so rapidly that we need people to stand up and say that. And that, I get a little bit frustrated when, last week or 2 weeks ago in California, when people saw it as, the demonstrators were somehow not recognizing that good things are being done, that it was sort of adversarial. I mean, it is adversarial to a degree, but it's really trying to create space for leaders like Jerry Brown and others to go further and to expand their policy toolkits.
Other perspectives on?
Yeah, this conversation is very alive in Canada, as I mentioned previously. There's a number, I would say majority of commentators who say that that the public needs to just sit down and shut up and let the oil sands expand because that's the only way we're going to save the climate. I mean, it's ridiculous, but that's how it's portrayed, and that's been led by the Canadian government and with either direct help of premiers like Premier Notley or the silence from others, and making it sound as though the massive expansions in fossil fuel production are somehow going to be outweighed even on domestic emissions by weak approaches on the demand side. And so we have a problem in Canada just because of the size of the oil industry and the emissions intensity of the oil sands, is that never mind where the oil goes and gets burned, but just on the production side. Massive expansion of the oil sands and half-assed kind of demand reduction responses in the country mean that overall we can't meet our climate goals, Paris climate goals, never mind the rest of these issues we're talking about in terms of global supply.
And also, I mean, in no other policy domain would advocates be kind of asked to make such a ridiculous choice. I mean, imagine with tobacco control, if the public health lobby was pushing for restrictions on advertising or lifting the age at which you could buy cigarettes, and a politician said, keep pushing for that and I'll cut the taxes on tobacco. Well, where else would this happen? All right, so I hate to say it, climate change is not the first and only complex policy and political problem countries have grappled with. And if we look in other policy domains, this tension between supply and demand side policy is imaginary. Right? In almost every successful policy domain, there's a combination that's pulling on multiple levers whenever the chance arises. So this idea, if you keep pushing for that, I'm going to take something off you, well, that's just kind of proof that we're pushing for something important. Otherwise, why would they threaten?
All right, well, maybe some thoughts from the audience. Here's where we've got 10 minutes left. I'd like to give an opportunity to circulate the microphone. And we'll take, let's take 3 questions from the audience, and then we'll turn to the panelists to respond. And try to keep your questions to questions more than statements, please.
Now, but I just want to caution everybody interpreting these, because the coal numbers they're not comparable with the oil numbers, and they're vastly exaggerated. And if you look at the BP numbers, for example, you have numbers that just don't make any sense, and if you know the production levels from country to country. And so it's my question is, does it actually help the debate to, in a sense, be using exaggerated values of reserves for coal, or hurt it? I'll just throw that out as a question I'd be interested in having more discussion on. And the second one is for Tim. I was recently looking at where coal mines have been shut down around the world, and I was very surprised to see that the underground mine, actually mines under the sea off of Cape Breton, was recently reopened. That had been subsidized for a long time and then was closed down. Could you say anything of what's the story with that? I was quite surprised to see that reopening. Thank you.
Take 2 more questions then.
Is that on? Okay. Chris Bataille with IDRI. This is a question for Pete. I'd just like to hear your comment or thoughts about how the governor's office squares the executive order for the carbon neutrality by 2045 against the oil industry. And there must be some sort of implied phase down or something. Otherwise, it doesn't compute. And just like to hear your comments.
Greg Matte, Oil Change International. Just thinking about Glada's comment about Aramco working with Mazda for more efficient engines, more efficient fuels, and thinking about that in the context of what happened in the early days of the fossil fuel industry in this country, and William Jevons's The Coal Question, where he observed that steam engines were getting more efficient, and that was leading to a dramatic increase in the use of coal because they were more competitive, they were cheaper to use, and so even though you could do the same amount of work for less coal, far more coal was ultimately being used. And this, I think, also relates to the questions about efficiency of production, for instance, in Alberta, and the notion of clean fossil fuels. The question I wanted to ask is, for most people, the idea of efficiency is one everyone can agree on in climate change. That's the nice stuff. But when one considers the rebound effect and what that does to enable more production and more consumption, I want to ask the question, is efficiency actually part of the problem rather than part of the solution?
All right. There's a big question to end it up with. So we can just take that. Why don't we go right down the table here? Pete, there was a question about oil and how that intersects with the Brown commitment.
Yeah, so the question was about how California has committed just recently to being carbon neutral across the whole economy by 2045? And does that actually imply a phase down of the oil industry? When I've put this question to folks in the governor's office and ARB, they don't have a direct answer, as you might imagine. Two things. One, their goal is on a net basis, and they are looking at that in part to prompt more sequestration, carbon storage on working lands in California. So there's going to be some negative emissions that they're hoping for there, possibly some offsets from outside California, though they're hoping that by 2045 the offsets aren't a thing anymore. The other response is, well, could they instead just export their oil instead and essentially put it, take it off ledger for California's carbon neutrality goals? To that, they said, no, that's not consistent with what the spirit of the carbon neutrality goals. So I think it remains to be seen, but it is a very good question, Chris, in terms of, does this essentially imply a phase down of oil production in California? It seems like that's something that this community could take up. Certainly in New Zealand, I heard unequivocally from Joe Tyndall also at GCAS at the summit that their carbon neutrality goal does imply a phase down of oil production, and that's why they're trying to send clear signals to the industry to start not doing new exploration and development now.
Efficiency. Yeah, it is a challenging question. It's right. It's true. Everybody can agree around efficiency, but not much gets done. So it's like the least sexy of the carbon mitigation tools because it's very, very difficult, and lots of different agencies and different parts of government and others need to be involved. So, it depends which countries you're talking about. Every country has massive potential gains from efficiency. In a country like Saudi, they're just crazy stupid, easy wins. So I think it is somewhere to start. It is a starting point. It's different. You've talked about vehicles. I think it is different for vehicles than it is in buildings, because in buildings you have this real potential for a complete step change, in passive building techniques that do both things. They're efficient and they can use solar power and heat pumps and other things that, even if there's a rebound effect, it doesn't necessarily mean more use of fossil fuels. So I think buildings we'll put to one side. Vehicles, I don't know. Do people want to drive more, longer, forever? I think there's a big battle to be had on logistics and air travel, of course. But for car driving, I wonder whether the answer is more cultural and lifestyle changes that will take place. I kind of agree with you that looking towards more efficient fuels and more efficient vehicles, it's only a short-term thing. Eventually, there has to be a complete change in the way that we drive and more use of electricity. But I think people are looking towards looking towards perhaps different models of car ownership and not owning cars. And I think there's living close or working, from home, not traveling so much. I think that will be interesting to look at how that develops. So I'd say not necessarily. So there have been, I should mention one thing, there have been that the MOU with Mazda seems fairly within the realm of sensibility. There was another plan that Saudi Aramco had, which was to have on-board carbon capture, like in the vehicle, which is so mad. It's desperate. So there's different levels, I think, to which people will go to keep liquid fuel in the vehicle market. But as far as we can see, it will have an end point.
I just have to tell a story about the carbon capture in the trunk thing, because it's one of my favorites. I'd never heard of this idea before, but when we were talking with a number of companies who shall remain nameless to protect the guilty in Alberta, they were telling us that they're giving me a hard time, saying, you guys are anti-technology. You really love all this crazy electric vehicle stuff. It's not really viable. Electric cars are never going to make up much of the market. But what we're really looking forward to is carbon capture in the trunk. And I was like, well, sure, I'll be happy to have that in my, 64 Pontiac if you could show me the box, show me that it works. But yeah, there's a lot of belief in technology and efficiency within that sector that is debatable whether it's ever achievable. On the coal mine, I think in Canada, just to be clear, the coal phase out isn't on the production side, it's on consumption of coal for electricity production. And that's where the regulatory movement is going. I think a new coal mine in Nova Scotia, I think, is a vestigial, oh yes, we're the coal place, and if we could find some way of selling some coal, then let's haul some of it out of the ground. I don't know where that's going or what the economic viability of that coal mine would be, but that's not where the regulatory push is on the supply side. It's a demand side change.
Can I just make a quick point about the efficiency? This is why we need to think through cutting with both arms of the scissors. Greg's point about energy efficiency. Imagine if California came out tomorrow and said, look, we're banning internal combustion engines. Everyone's going to electric cars. Well, that means there's all that enormous amount of petrol, of that gasoline, presumably will now be consumed somewhere else in the world. But when we talk about demand-side policy, no one is ever critical of demand-side policy, saying there's no point having energy efficiency standards in California. You're just going to free up petrol for somewhere else. But if you said, well, let's stop producing oil in California, say, well, that's ridiculous. Someone will just produce it somewhere else. So if there's carbon leakage on supply-side policy, guess what? There's carbon leakage on demand-side policy. It's economics. All right, that's why you got to look at supply and demand simultaneously. So, the economist in me says, of course you want energy efficiency, of course you do. And at the same time, you want to restrict supply to mop up that energy efficiency. So energy efficiency is overwhelmingly a better idea than energy inefficiency. But this is the octopus. It's just coming to hit you again. Like you can get so confused with this stuff. Of course energy efficiency is a good idea, and of course reducing supply is a good idea. And when we don't cut with both arms of the scissors, we get confused with these weird paradoxes that aren't paradoxes at all. They're just first-year economics.
Okay. No paradoxes. I like that. So with that, can I borrow your scissors and cut off this conversation right now, because it's time for a break. And Ron, I'll get to your question at the break. You might have noticed I left the units off that chart. So thank you so much. I want to give a big round of applause to our fantastic panel.